You won't believe what happened the day I decided to change the lock on my front door. It all started as a simple move to protect my home after some neighborhood issues. But things quickly spiraled into a drama I never expected. Just as I finished swapping out the lock, the HOA president showed up and she was furious. Her voice echoed down the street, screaming like I'd broken some unspoken rule. What I didn't know at the time was that the sheriff was quietly watching everything unfold from my very own deck. This wasn't just any neighborhood disagreement. It was a clash between someone standing up for their rights and an HOA leader who seemed to think she had all the power. From the moment she stormed over, her anger was clear, and it felt like the whole neighborhood was holding its breath. The tension between us was so thick you could cut it with a knife. But while she was yelling, I caught a glimpse of the sheriff's calm, steady gaze. That changed everything. Why was the sheriff there? What was he waiting for? And how did he even know to show up at that exact moment? These questions were swirling in my mind as I tried to keep my cool and figure out what this confrontation was really about. The HOA president's screaming didn't scare me, but the sheriff's presence made me realize this situation was far bigger than just a lock or a neighborhood rule. This story isn't just about a lock, it's about power, authority, and standing your ground when things get messy. What happened next would turn the whole neighborhood upside down, and trust me, you'll want to stick around to see how it all plays out. So stay with me, because what you're about to hear is something few people talk about, and it's a story that still gives me chills. Before that day, I never thought much about the HOA president or the rules she enforced. Like most people in the neighborhood, I just tried to keep my head down and follow the guidelines until small things started to pile up. Quietly, I noticed how strict the HOA had become. They controlled everything from what color you could paint your front door to how late you could park on the street. At first, it felt like they were just keeping the neighborhood neat. But then, it started to feel more like control for control's sake, and the HOA president, she seemed to take it personally, like she was the one running the show and anyone who didn't follow her rules was a threat. The lock situation wasn't just about safety for me. I had found out that someone had been trying doors in the neighborhood late at night. It was unsettling, and I wanted to make sure my family was protected. When I called the HOA to let them know I'd be changing the lock, they acted like it was some kind of crime. I was shocked at how quickly the president blew up, accusing me of breaking HOA rules without even hearing me out. Her shouting wasn't just loud, it was meant to intimidate. What made everything more confusing was the sheriff standing silently nearby. He didn't step in right away or say a word. Instead, he just watched like he was waiting for the right moment or gathering information. Was he there because of a complaint? Or had he been called about something else? I didn't know, but his presence made me question everything. Was this about a simple lock change? Or was there something deeper going on in our neighborhood? As the HOA president's voice grew louder, I stood firm. Knowing this wasn't just about locks or rules, it was about who really had the power. But what would happen next? That was the question no one had an answer to. As the standoff continued, I started to realize there was more beneath the surface than just a dispute over a lock. The HOA president wasn't just angry about me changing it. She seemed to be sending a message to the whole neighborhood. It was like she wanted everyone to know who was in charge, and she wasn't afraid to use intimidation to keep control. Neighbors had told me stories about how she'd come down hard on people for the smallest things, from trimming their hedges incorrectly to hosting barbecues without permission. Her tight grip had created a lot of quiet frustration, but few people dared to speak up. Then there was the sheriff, still watching from the deck above. I started to wonder if he was connected to something bigger, maybe a pattern of complaints or tension between residents and the HOA. Some neighbors whispered about past incidents where the sheriff had to step in during heated HOA meetings or disputes. Others said the president might have made calls to law enforcement before, trying to back up her authority with official power. But no one really knew what to believe because things always seemed to get swept under the rug. Meanwhile, my own family was caught in the middle. My kids noticed the yelling and the officer standing nearby, and it unsettled them. I felt torn between standing up for my rights and keeping the peace at home. Changing that lock was supposed to be a simple step for our safety. But suddenly, it was turning into a neighborhood showdown that threatened to affect everyone on the street. The HOA president kept demanding I undo the lock change, claiming it was illegal or against our agreement. But when I asked for proof or a clear explanation, she just shouted louder and refused to answer. The sheriff, however, remained silent, as if waiting for me to make a move or for someone else to speak up. It felt like a game of patience, with power and control hanging in the balance sand. I wasn't sure who would blink first. What was really going on behind the scenes? And how far was this going to go? The answers felt just out of reach, leaving the whole situation charged with tension and uncertainty. Days passed, but the tension didn't ease up. In fact, it only grew stronger. Every time I stepped outside, I felt the weight of the HOA president's glare, like she was waiting for me to slip up. She started showing up at neighborhood meetings more aggressively, rallying others to her side with whispers and half-truths. The quiet frustration I'd sensed before was bubbling up into open conflict. Meanwhile, the sheriff's presence lingered. Sometimes he'd drive by slowly. Other times, I'd catch him watching from a distance. It was clear he hadn't forgotten that day on my deck. My neighbors started to take sides. And the friendly faces I'd known suddenly looked different. Some nodded at me with sympathy. Others avoided eye contact, worried about getting involved. Rumors spread about the HOA president's history with local law enforcement, and whether she had the power to influence decisions beyond the neighborhood rules. I even overheard talk about possible legal actions or fines coming my way if I didn't reverse the lock change. It felt like the walls were closing in, and I had no idea who to trust. At home, the stress was wearing on me. I kept wondering if I'd made a mistake standing my ground, but every time I looked at my family, I knew protecting them was worth it. I tightened my grip on the situation, but the uncertainty was hard to shake. What if this escalated into something bigger? What if the sheriff's silence meant trouble was coming? Every knock on the door made my heart race. Then, one evening, the HOA president showed up again, this time with a handful of neighbors and a serious look I hadn't seen before. The air was thick with anticipation, and even the sheriff appeared, unexpectedly, stepping closer than ever before. The moment felt electric, like everything was about to explode. Words were exchanged, voices rose, and the quiet neighborhood transformed into a battleground. No one knew what would happen next. Would the law side with me, or would the HOA president's power win out? The lock on my door wasn't just metal. Anymore, it had become a symbol of something much bigger. And the final showdown was just around the corner, just when I thought things couldn't get any more intense. The situation took an unexpected turn. As the HOA president confronted me and the sheriff stood nearby, a knock came at my back door. I wasn't expecting anyone else, and the sudden arrival sent a chill down my spine. When I opened the door, it wasn't a neighbor or another official. It was the property management company that handles the HOA's business. They brought a letter that no one had mentioned before, something I hadn't seen or been warned about. The letter claimed that the lock change violated not only HOA rules, but also local regulations, and it hinted at serious consequences, fines, legal actions, even potential eviction notices if I didn't comply immediately. What shocked me more was that the HOA president and the sheriff seemed to exchange a quick glance, as if this letter was part of a plan I hadn't been aware of. Suddenly, it felt like the conflict wasn't just between me and the HOA president anymore. There were bigger forces at play, and I was caught right in the middle at the same time. Rumors began circulating around the neighborhood that some residents had been secretly recording the heated exchanges. And those recordings might be used to back up complaints or build a case against me. It was like the entire community had turned into a courtroom, and every word, every action was being judged. The sheriff's silent watchfulness suddenly felt more like surveillance. My family was getting more anxious by the day. Friends warned me to be careful, suggesting that the HOA president's power might reach further than I imagined. And I couldn't stop wondering, was this really just about a lock? Or was it about control, influence, and something far darker lurking beneath the surface? The stakes had risen, the lines were drawn, and the next moves could change everything. I was left standing there, lock changed, heart pounding, caught between a furious HOA president, a watching sheriff, and a community that seemed ready to turn on me. The real question was, what would happen next? The tension hit its peak one afternoon when the HOA president, flanked by a few neighbors and the property management rep, showed up at my doorstep once again. The letter was in her hand, and her voice was sharp, demanding I remove the new lock immediately or face the consequences spelled out in that official notice. The sheriff stood quietly to the side, his presence heavier than ever, watching every move I made. I could feel the weight of the entire neighborhood's eyes on me, waiting for what I would do next. But instead of backing down, I calmly pulled out a folder I'd been preparing for weeks: documents, emails, and even a recorded conversation, proving the HOA president had overstepped her authority multiple times, and that the lock change was within my rights as a homeowner. The letter they presented was indeed real, but it was filled with vague wording and lacked any real legal backing. I explained to everyone how the HOA's rules were often enforced unfairly, and that no law required me to keep the old lock. The neighbors murmured among themselves, and even the sheriff nodded quietly. Finally, breaking his silence, just when it seemed like the battle was turning in my favor, the unexpected twist came. The sheriff stepped forward and revealed he had been investigating a series of HOA complaints for months, including allegations that the president had manipulated HOA funds and pressured residents unfairly to maintain control. His watching from my deck wasn't coincidence, it was part of a larger inquiry. Suddenly, the focus shifted from my lock to the president herself. Faced with mounting evidence and the sheriff's investigation, the HOA president's confident mask cracked. She backed down, promising to cooperate, while the neighborhood began to breathe a collective sigh of relief. My lock stayed changed, a symbol of standing up for what's right. But the story wasn't over. With the sheriff now involved, a deeper reckoning was coming, one that would change the neighborhood forever. And as the dust settled, I knew one thing for sure: sometimes the smallest actions spark the biggest change. After the sheriff's revelation, things in the neighborhood slowly began to change. The HOA president, once so loud and controlling, started to step back as investigations moved forward. Some neighbors, who had been hesitant to speak up before, found new courage to share their own experiences. It became clear that the conflict wasn't just about a lock or a roulette, was about fairness, respect, and holding people accountable. The sheriff's involvement brought a new sense of hope to the community, reminding us that no one is above the law. For me, the lock on my door became more than just a security measure. It became a symbol of standing up for what's right, even when it feels uncomfortable or scary. I realized that sometimes you have to push back against unfair rules and people who try to control others without listening. It wasn't easy, and there were moments I doubted myself, but having support from some neighbors and the truth on my side made all the difference. The HOA eventually made some changes to its leadership and policies, making the neighborhood a little friendlier and more transparent. The sheriff stayed in touch with residents, helping ensure that things didn't go back to how they were. And while the drama around the lock change might seem small to some, it sparked a bigger conversation about community, respect, and standing up for your rights. Looking back, I'm grateful for that day when I decided to change the lock even if it led to a lot of tension and unexpected challenges. It showed me the power of staying calm, gathering facts, and standing firm when it counts. If you're ever facing a tough situation in your neighborhood or community, remember that you don't have to face it alone. Sometimes, the smallest actions can lead to the biggest changes, and standing up for yourself can inspire others too. Do the same. Thanks for listening to my story. If you've ever dealt with an HOA or faced similar challenges, I'd love to hear your experience in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more real-life stories that matter.